Yeah, thank you. Honestly, I think this book by Friedman is a fresh breath of fresh air on the on many of the post-apartheid biographies that I've read. Because many of the biographies that I've read, they are largely about the lived experience of individuals in the fight against apartheid. And I think this biography is an intellectual. It's a biography about the history of radical ideas in South Africa, particularly Marxist ideas in South Africa and how Harold Wolpe critically applied those ideas under the conditions of apartheid and capitalism in South Africa. Now, in my talk, I'll start by commenting on what I consider to be silences in this book. Firstly, discussing Wolpe's contribution in the cheap labor thesis. I note how the post-second international Marxists, including Wolpe, ignored the contribution of Karl Kautsky to the debate on the articulation of the modes of production. And secondly, I also show that Friedman's book perpetuates Wolpe's silences on the role of tribal authorities in reproducing tribalism, thus concealing the incompleteness of the democratization project in South Africa, particularly in the countryside. And this, of course, will be followed by a comment on the importance of this book for the South African Marxist tradition. However, I will take up what Friedman's book considers to be defensible in Marxism and what is inadequate in Marxism. And I must indicate from the upfront that I'm not one of the advocates of certain caricatures of Marxism, that Marxism explains everything under the sun. However, I will point out that Friedman's book presents Marxism in an incomplete manner, thus making it easy to identify purported theoretical inadequacies, including race, ethnicity, and the state. And notwithstanding what I consider as weaknesses and silences in Friedman's book, which are common to any book, because a book is supposed to generate debate, ideas, it's not to answer everything. And our task as reviewers is to point out the weaknesses, the silences, and that's my role today. And I will argue that all students, scholars, activists interested in the South African radical scholarship on political economy of race, gender, ethnicity, education, and the state must read this book. If I was a first year lecturer here, I would prescribe this book. Now, let's start on the silences. Friedman shows, and I don't want to repeat this, that Wolpe shifted from the idea that capitalism needed apartheid in order to reproduce itself, to an idea that the relationship between capitalism and apartheid was not a necessary one, but was an opportunistic relationship. Now, the question, and then of course, this led him to be in agreement with Lipton, Mellon Lipton, but using different conceptual categories, but reaching the same conclusion with her. But I want to pose a question to Friedman on the shift from what I call the necessity, the idea that capitalism needed apartheid, to the idea that the relationship was contingent, that is, capitalism did not necessarily need apartheid. I want to check whether this shift in Wolpe's thinking was consistent with Wolpe's Althusserian, Laclauian theoretical framework in which race, ethnicity, state are accorded some relative autonomy from class and capitalism. Because I think it's important, what are the influences? Was it just influenced by liberal critiques, or within the Althusserian or Louis Althusser theoretical framework, which largely influenced Wolpe? It can account for the shifts in Wolpe's thinking. I want to pose that. But the second point, and I think Friedman points out that one of the key interventions by Wolpe here was to show that capitalism does not necessarily have to destroy the pre-capitalist modes of production in order to reproduce itself. It can maintain the capitalist mode of production and use the pre-capitalist mode of production, the reserve, the peasant mode of production, in such a way that it benefits, is functional for the reproduction of capitalism. But what is not raised in this book is the extent to which, the extent to which Wolpe, or not Wolpe, the extent to which Lenin's demonization of Second International Marxists, particularly Karl Kautsky, had an effect in downplaying the intellectual contribution of some of the Second International Marxists, such as Karl Kautsky. Because when I read Wolpe's arguments on the articulation of the mode of production, if you read Karl Kautsky's debate against Lenin on what will be the fate of the pre-capitalist mode of production, Kautsky takes more or less the same position and say, no, capitalism does not necessarily have to obliterate the pre-capitalist mode of production. The two can exist with each other in a much more complementary way. And this is a huge contribution that comes out of that tradition of the Second International. And for me, it will seem that the Leninist style of conducting polemics has impoverished Marxism, in that it has influenced subsequent Marxists after Lenin, because it tended to ignore, as I said, some of this contribution. And many of us, I must say, when we were introduced to Marxism, I only learned about Karl Kautsky through Lenin's text, The Proletarian Revolution, and the Renegade Kautsky. I even thought maybe Renegade is the first name. Kautsky is the last name, so that's the only thing I knew about Kautsky, the second. I'm not saying that the Marxists of the Second International, Bernstein and others, were all perfect. I mean, they made mistakes, and their concept. But this, I do think, it has denied us an opportunity even to learn about some of the Marxists at that moment who contributed to the building of the Marxist tradition in the world. And I'm afraid that the Leninist mode of engagement, which I do think that is also reproduced, was recorded in the Stephen's book, is also the tendency amongst us as Leninists that everything Lenin said was right, and many left activists today also tend to present their arguments in a very levelist way. You're a Stalinist, you're a Trotskyite. And what's your argument? You're a Stalinist, and it's just a repetitive, and it doesn't get deeper into what are the issues, what's at stake. And we tend to use those kind of labels which are not very, very useful. And I'm also learning as a young activist that the Communist Party even banned reading of Trotsky. Some of the comrades that I talk to, they say, you know what, I'm only reading Trotsky now. I've never read Trotsky. All my life in the struggle against apartheid, because Trotsky was demonized. So it's only now that I'm engaging with Trotsky. So there's a tradition which I do think that it had some effect in the world. And then I'm not saying that this had an impact on Wolpe and all that, but I do think these are some of the questions that we need to begin to raise. Now, on another silence which I've picked up in the book is the fact that Wolpe's cheap labor thesis pay more attention on the mode of surplus extraction and less or little attention on the mode of rule, particularly in the Bantustan. And I think Mamdani's seminal work has also made this point, this criticism. Well, Wolpe asserts, as it's also indicated in the book, albeit without demonstrating, he asserts that black people were consigned to rule by chiefs in the tribal homelands. But this assertion does not theorize how tribal authority reproduces tribalism, despotism in the country's right. So in other words, Wolpe under-theorized the politics of the reserves, particularly in the Bantustan. In fact, this theme disappears completely in Wolpe's later works, particularly race, class, and apartheid. And Stephen's book is also quite silent on this. In my view, it then tends to reproduce these silences without raising this issue. And I think without an analysis of the mode of rule in the countryside, we miss out how the class struggle is mediated through tribal identities or tribalism in the post-apartheid South Africa, e.g. Malamulele. We also miss out how tribalism also reproduces xenophobia. Everyone is afraid to tackle the king today in KwaZulu-Natal for the statements that he has made. So, and I do think that part and parcel of tackling the democratic project in South Africa, we need to take this question very seriously. The other point, which I hope is the last one, no, it's not the last one, it's the second last one. It's, and I think Stephen does a good job in showing that Wolpe wrote in the period in which specific debates on specific issues were guided by big theories, liberalism and Marxism, with a transformative vision for social transformation or social emancipation. Wolpe wrote, theorized in the period of fascism, imperialism, colonialism, and more importantly, in the era of national and socialist revolution led by prolific intellectuals such as Mao, Kwame Nkrumah, C.L.R. James, Eric Williams, Frantz Fanon, Amilcar Cabral, George Padmore, Du Bois, who were also influenced by revolutionary intellectuals such as Vladimir Lenin and Trotsky. And this great intellectual, it took place outside the universities. And of course, in universities, there were great debates, such as amongst political philosophers, political scientists, from which Wolpe learns a lot from them. And in this period, it is when the Dar es Salaam debate is taking place in the University of Dar es Salaam amongst African scholars about the post-colonial condition. And therefore, I think this book is quite refreshing for bringing back the ideas of Marxism in the agenda, because in the mainstream academia, there's a lot of post-structuralist, post-modern, obscurist theories, which are very confusing in my view. I'm sorry if there's some of you here. I don't find them entirely useful. They're too obscure. You don't understand what is being said, signify the floating. You just get confused in the reading. And the tendency is to present the sophistication of the language is a substitute for a coherent and analytical argument. And I do think that this book it's quite important in that instance, that it brings back those ideas on the agenda. Because like I said, there's a lot of obscurist postmodern theories which is associated with the cultural trend that we've seen. But I think, and then on the left as well, I'm afraid to say this, There's a lot about an analysis of neoliberalism and all these kind of things. Many of these things that are coming out are not even rooted in the Marxist analytical categories. You hardly hear the notion about surplus value, how it works in the current post-apartheid South Africa and all these kind of things. So my view is that this book is important in reviving, bringing back those ideas on the agenda of the South African academia. But my concern, though, is that the book acknowledges that there's a displacement, or there's a significant decline in Marxism in the mainstream academia. And I must say that this displacement is not just a South African one. My concern, though, is that the book does not explain why this Marxist tradition is being displaced. It doesn't explain, and even some of the people who are Marxist, why have they changed? Because the book points out that many of the people that will be influenced, they are no longer Marxist. Why is that the case? It will be interesting to get into this. And my sort of hypothesis is that it's because in the context where the working class is on the rise, and Marxism become their theory, and then emancipatory vision that informs their struggles and all that, that's when you're more likely to see the interest in the study of Marxism, including by the right wing, by the way. Because in that period, when Wolpe is writing, you see universities such as Stellenbosch setting up an institute for study of Marxism in order to defeat Marxism itself and the popular struggles that were informed by Marxism. And by the way, this institute was also funded by the apartheid military agents through COVID funding and all. It's quite documented, demonstrating how Marxism at that point was the ideas that were informing the struggles for social emancipation in this country. And of course, in the liberal institutions, that's university, Marxism is also getting more, is studied in order to aid the working class struggles which were beginning to emerge in the 1970s, and the critique of the Soviet Marxism, which was quite dominant in the ANC-led alliance. So in fact, the decline in the mainstream academia, like I said, it's a global phenomenon, and it's for that reason that, in my view, you see a lot of studies on Islam, which are not grounded in Marxism or in materialistic understanding of history. You see a lot of the studies around this globally, which, like I said, informed largely by postmodern theories. The last point I want to make is that Friedman makes a point that there's certain things that can be maintained in Marxism. There's certain things that need to be transcended, and I'm also sure, Stephen, whether you use the notion of transcendence to mean abandoning, so you've got to, yeah, you clarify me on that one. So, so he makes a convincing case for retaining some of the aspects of Marxism, one of which is class, even though he acknowledges that Marx was not the first to discover the theoretical category of class. And he, like he said, he made a very convincing argument why we should pay attention to the private power, which is essentially class and all that. But if class is not necessarily a Marxist category, why accord Marxism privileged status with regard to class? Why is it that the book does not argue that we should preserve proudly? Who argues that private property is theft? Why do we say in order to maintain Marxism, we must maintain class? Why don't we just say, since Marx is not the first one who discovered class, so there's a lot of people who have discovered class, Proudhon is one of them. So why don't we say, let's retain Proudhon, because Proudhon also identified class as the important category through which we understand society. So in other words, if class was not Marx's major theoretical category to social science, what was his critical contribution? It's not my intention here to get into pedantic discussion of what constitutes Marxism dialectical, all those kind of things. But I just want to humbly submit that Marx's main contribution was his analysis of capitalism. Of course, Marx correctly saw class as a social agent through which capitalism is maintained and reproduced, and a social agent through which capitalism could be defeated. So I do think that if we're to pay attention on Marx's understanding of capitalism, how it works, we will begin to ask whether, through the analysis of capitalism, can't we deal with some of the issues that the book suggests that the Marx theory, if we frame Marx's contribution in those terms, I do think that we might reach a different conclusion on whether Marx's theory cannot accommodate some of the concerns that the book suggests that it cannot adequately cover. But I'm not going to go into those issues. Maybe during the discussion, we will have a discussion on that. The last point I want to make is that, and this is a very important point, particularly in this period, Friedman he also makes a very important point about the perennial dilemma facing dissenting intellectual and political movements. There's a huge difference between being loyal to an emancipatory vision and being critical of party practices. But today in South Africa, being a critical member of parties' analytical framework, strategy, and tactic, including conjunctural analysis, is associated with being disloyal to the party itself, including its vision. We learn from the book that Wolpe survived expulsion from the party because, not that Wolpe, Peter, from my reading, Wolpe survived being in the party. It was not a question of when does he live and all that. He survived in the party because the forces within the party that were supportive of the critical thinking were strong. And we've got to ask whether, in today's South Africa, the forces that support critical thinking are stronger or not. And by the way, I'm still a member of the party, just for your record.
The University of Johannesburg. Rethink, reinvent.